Hello, this is Professor Kuehn, and welcome back to my lectures on astronomy, where we are talking about the work of Nicholas Copernicus, his On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres, published in 1543. This is perhaps one of the most famous astronomy books ever written, because in this book, Copernicus argues that the Earth is moving around the Sun rather than the Sun moving around the Earth. Of course, Copernicus was aware that he did not come up with this idea. He saw his work as resurrecting an ancient idea that was discarded too quickly. In any case, this was influential because he gave detailed arguments for why he believed in the heliocentric model rather than the geocentric model. In my previous lecture, we talked specifically about the preface to his book on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres. This preface was written by a Lutheran theologian named Andrew Osiander. And in this preface, Osiander argued that Copernicus was not so much trying to present a new theory as the true theory, but rather as just one more hypothetical calculational tool that would allow one to calculate where Mars or Jupiter or Saturn were in the sky on any particular night. This served to really smooth the publication of this book so that people could see it not as a claim, a competing truth claim, but rather as simply a useful piece of instrumentation in order to do practical calculations. We'll see that when we're actually reading Copernicus, he takes a very different viewpoint than Osiander had taken in the preface, because Copernicus actually argues that he thinks that the worldview that he's presenting, with the sun at the center and the earth going around, is actually true and correct. Anyhow, we're on page 131 in A Student's Guide Through the Great Physics Text, Volume 3, and this is where we have a preface and a dedication. The dedication is written by Copernicus to Pope Paul III. So, I'm going to read parts of this and then just comment on it as I go. He says, "I can reckon easily enough, most holy Father, that as soon as certain people learn that in these books of mine, which I have written about the revolutions of the spheres of the world, I attribute certain motions to the terrestrial globe, they will immediately shout to have me and my opinion hooted off the stage." So he's here aware that what he's going to be saying is something that is going to be controversial. And he's saying that the terrestrial globe, that is the earth itself, is in motion. He says, "For my own works do not please me so much that I do not weigh what judgments others will pronounce concerning them." So he's saying he's not so self-satisfied, he's not so happy with what he's done that he's completely immune to criticism. He goes on to say, "And although I realize that the conceptions of a philosopher are placed beyond the judgment of the crowd, because it is his loving duty to seek the truth in all things, insofar as God has granted that to human reason, nevertheless, I think we should avoid opinions utterly foreign to rightness." So he's saying here that when he uses the term philosopher, he's really talking about anyone who considers the true nature of the world. So he's saying that the opinions of philosophers, the ruminations of philosophers, are really beyond the judgment of the crowd, of the many, who really have no interest in philosophy. He's saying what I'm going to be saying is really beyond their judgment. They are not going to be able to make qualified judgments on what he's saying, but nonetheless, it's the philosopher's duty to say things that are true, insofar as God allows him to do so. He says, "Nevertheless, I think we should avoid opinions utterly foreign to rightness." Okay? And then he goes on, I'm going to skip a couple of lines here, and he says, "For a long time, I was in great difficulty as to whether I should bring to light my commentaries written to demonstrate the earth's movement, or whether it would not be better to follow the example of the Pythagoreans and certain others who used to hand down the mysteries of their philosophy not in writing, but by word of mouth, and only to their relatives and friends." Notice what Copernicus is doing here. He's saying that he thought about not even writing down these ruminations or these thoughts that he had. And he would be in good company not doing that, because after all, the ancient Pythagoreans taught their students by word of mouth. Why would they do this? Well, think about what happens in a classroom. In a classroom, there's a give and take. There's questions and answers where you can ask the teacher what they mean by something, and the teacher can explain themselves. But if you're simply reading a book or watching a lecture, there's not the same back and forth, and it's very easy to take things out of context and make the teacher or the professor look silly. I mean, we see this kind of thing happen all the time with politicians, right? We see people taking the comments of a carefully crafted speech out of context and then splashing them all over the internet to make that politician look like a fool. Copernicus was afraid of just this kind of thing. If he wrote down his teachings, the people who really don't care about what he's saying might just take snippets of what he's saying and splash it all over the news, so to speak, so as to make him look stupid. So he's saying maybe the better way to do it is just to only teach those who you know have a sincere interest in learning. That's what the Pythagoreans did, and that's what Copernicus had originally planned to do. He said the Pythagoreans and certain others who used to hand down the mysteries of their philosophy not in writing, but by word of mouth, and only to their relatives and friends, witness the letter of Lysis to Hipparchus. They, however, seem to me to have done that not, as some judge, out of a jealous unwillingness to communicate their doctrines, but in order that things of very great beauty, which have been investigated by the loving care of great men, should not be scorned by those who find it a bother to expand any great energy on letters, on writing or reading, except on money-making variety, or who are provoked by the exhortations and examples of others to the liberal study of philosophy, but on account of their natural stupidity, hold the position among philosophers that drones hold among bees. So again, he's emphasizing that there are people who really aren't going to care to read what he has to say. Rather, they're simply going to criticize them out of a lack of knowledge rather than out of understanding. And he wanted to avoid this kind of thing. There's an element here, think about Jesus' parable where he says, you don't want to throw your pearls to pigs. That's exactly what Copernicus is saying here. He says, therefore, then I weighed these things in my mind. The scorn which I had to fear on account of the newness and absurdity of my opinions almost drove me to abandon a work already undertaken. And then he goes on to say, but my friends made me change my course, in spite of my long-continued hesitation and even resistance. So by talking to some of his friends, he decided to change his mind and to publish his work. First among them was Nicholas Schoenberg, the Cardinal of Capua, so that's a leader in the church who convinced him to write down what he was thinking about. A man distinguished in all branches of learning. Next to him was my devoted friend Tiedemann Geiss, Bishop of Kulm, a man filled with the greatest zeal for the divine and liberal arts, for he in particular urged me frequently and even spurred me on by adding reproaches into publishing this book, and letting come to light a work which I had kept hidden among my things for not merely 9 years, but for almost 4 times 9 years. So he's saying he's been thinking about this for some 36 years and keeping it secret, and then these leaders in the church were saying, no, you should write this down. This is important for you to transmit. He says, not a few other learned and distinguished men demanded the same thing of me, urging me to refuse no longer on account of the fear which I felt, to contribute my work to the common utility of those who are really interested in mathematics. They said that the absurder my teaching about the movement of the earth now seems to very many persons, the more wonder and thanksgiving will it be to the object of when, after the publication of my commentaries, those same persons see the fog of absurdity dissipated by my luminous demonstration. So although people right now might see it as absurd, once they actually take the time to read it and study it, the fog will be dissipated and they'll be enlightened by what he has to say. Accordingly, he says, I was led by such persuasion and by that hope finally to permit my friends to undertake the publication of a work which they had long sought from me. He goes on to say, but perhaps your holiness will not be so much surprised at my giving the results of my nocturnal study to the light, after having taken such care in working them out, that I did not hesitate to put in writing my conceptions as to the movement of the earth, as you will be eager to hear from me what came into my mind, that in opposition to the general opinion of mathematicians, and almost in opposition to common sense, I should dare to imagine some movement of the earth. So he's saying here that some mathematicians, remember mathematics and astronomy were very closely intertwined at this point, and many mathematicians who were raised on the work of Ptolemy, a very mathematical work explaining the geocentric model in great detail, they were probably going to find his opinions very new and perhaps absurd. And so I am unwilling to hide from your holiness, from the Pope, that nothing except my knowledge that mathematicians have not agreed with one another in their researches move me to think out a different scheme of drawing up the movements of the spheres of the world. So he's saying here that even the mathematicians, the astronomers, do not agree among themselves as to what the correct mathematical scheme might be in understanding the motion of the planets. So he is going to contribute his own views in light of the fact that there's not even unanimity among mathematicians as things stand. He says, for in the first place, mathematicians are so uncertain about the movements of the sun and moon that they can neither demonstrate nor observe the unchanging magnitude of the revolving year. They don't even know exactly how long a year is, he's saying. Then in setting up the solar and lunar movements and those of the other 5 wandering stars, the planets, they do not employ the same principles, assumptions, or demonstrations for the revolutions and apparent movements. So again, there's disagreement even among mathematicians. For some make use of homocentric circles, that is, circles having the exact same center, others of eccentric circles and epicycles, by means of which, however, they do not fully attain what they seek. So even by making complicated schemes of multiple, perhaps overlapping and displaced circles, they still don't have, in their own opinion, a correct model of the universe. For although those who have put their trust in homocentric circles have shown that various different movements can be composed of such circles, nevertheless they have not been able to establish anything for certain that would fully correspond to the phenomena. But even if those who have thought up eccentric circles seem to have been able for the most part to compute the apparent movements numerically by those means, they have in the meanwhile admitted a great deal which seems to contradict the first principles of regularity of movement. So even by using circles that are not centered directly on the Earth, they have eccentric or displaced circles and epicycles, they still are producing these theories that contradict some of the principles that they are stating are important to them. Moreover, they have not been able to discover or to infer the chief point of all, that is, the form of the world and the certain commensurability of its parts. But they are in exactly the same fix as someone taking from different places hands, feet, head, and other limbs, shaped very beautifully, but not with reference to one body and without correspondence to another, so that such parts made up a monster rather than a man. So he's saying here that essentially their theories, because they're cobbled together from disparate parts, they seem to make up kind of a monstrosity, right? So it's as if one were to take the hands of one animal and the feet of another and the head of another and put it together, you would make a monster. And he's saying that in essence that their theories are monstrous. They're not beautiful. They don't fit together quite right. And so in the process of demonstration, which they call method, they are found either to have omitted something necessary or to have admitted something foreign, which by no means pertains to the matter, and they would by no means have been in this fix if they had followed sure principles. For if the hypotheses they assumed were not false, everything which followed from the hypotheses would have been verified without fail. And though what I am saying may be obscure right now, nevertheless it will become clear at the proper place.